Come closer, my child. Do not rush this moment. Let the noise settle. Let the weight you have been carrying loosen its grip, even if only slightly. I am speaking now not because everything is resolved, but because you are ready to hear what you could not hear before. You have walked into this moment thinking you arrived late, thinking you missed something important, thinking the door already closed. But listen to me. This is not the end of your story. This is the place where you finally realize you were never alone. I saw you when you sat in silence pretending to be strong. I saw you when you smiled for others while something inside you quietly broke. You thought no one noticed the way your prayers changed, how they became shorter, heavier, more tired. You thought heaven grew distant because answers did not come the way you expected. But I have been closer than your breath, closer than your own thoughts. Even when you stopped speaking to me the way you used to, I never stopped listening. You believed endings always come with noise, with slammed doors, with obvious goodbyes. But some endings arrive quietly. They look like pauses. They look like waiting. They look like confusion. And you mistook this pause for abandonment. You mistook my silence for absence. Yet all along, I was standing guard over what you could not yet see. There were nights you lay awake replaying moments, wondering where things went wrong, wondering if you had failed, wondering if you were too much or not enough. You carried guilt that was never yours. You accepted blame for things that were never in your control. I watched you take responsibility for storms you did not create. And still, I covered you. You are here now because something in your spirit refused to fully give up. Even when you said you were done, even when you whispered that you could not do this anymore, something deeper kept breathing. That was me. That was my hand steadying you when your knees weakened. That was my voice holding you together when everything felt like it was falling apart. This place you are standing in feels unfamiliar because it is sacred ground disguised as disappointment. It feels empty because it was meant to strip away illusions, not to destroy you. I had to remove certain voices so you could hear mine again. I had to quiet certain paths so you would stop running toward what was never meant to hold you. This was not punishment. This was protection. You were not forgotten in the waiting. You were being hidden. There are things forming around you right now that could not survive exposure before their time. I shielded you from outcomes you prayed for that would have broken you if they arrived too soon. I delayed answers to spare your heart, not to ignore it. And my child, if your heart feels stirred as you listen, if something inside you recognizes my voice, take a moment and let that acknowledgement flow outward. Let others find this reassurance too. Gently support this message by liking it, by sharing it, by subscribing if you feel led. And if you are able, type in the comments, "I was never alone." Not for me, but as a quiet declaration for your own spirit. You are not weak for feeling tired. You are not faithless for asking questions. You are not broken because you needed rest. I never measured you by your productivity or your endurance. I measured you by your heart, and your heart never left me, even when you felt lost. There are chapters behind you that still ache when you think about them. There are names, moments, and promises that feel unfinished. I know. I was there when those chapters closed, even when you did not understand why. Closure does not always come with clarity. Sometimes it comes with trust. Sometimes it comes later, when you finally see the full picture. Right now, you are standing at the threshold, not of an ending but of a remembering. You are remembering who carried you. You are remembering who whispered strength into your spirit when your own words ran out. You are remembering that even in your loneliest moments, you were being watched over, guided, and gently redirected. Do not rush forward yet. Let this truth settle into you. Let it wrap around the places that still feel exposed. Here's more I will reveal. There are things about to make sense. But first, you must understand this foundation. You were never alone. Not then. Not now. Not for a single breath. My child, let me take you back to the moment you thought everything ended. Not to wound you again, but to heal what still trembles when you remember it. There was a specific point where your heart whispered, "This is it. This is where it stops." You did not announce it out loud. You did not collapse dramatically. You simply felt something go quiet inside you. Hope did not scream when it left. It folded itself small and waited in the corner of your soul, afraid to be disappointed again. You remember the exact season. Year felt heavy then. Days blended together. You kept moving because you had to, not because you wanted to. From the outside, it looked like survival. From the inside, it felt like standing at the edge of something you could not name, staring into an uncertainty that frightened you more than pain ever did. Pain, at least, had shape. This did not. You told yourself stories in that place. You told yourself that maybe this was the consequence of something you did wrong. Maybe you misheard me. Maybe you wanted something I never intended to give. Maybe you stayed too long, hoped too hard, trusted too deeply. And quietly, without realizing it, you began to treat yourself like the problem. But listen to me now. That moment was not the end. It was the collapse of an illusion. What ended was not your destiny, not your calling, not your future. What ended was your ability to keep pretending that what was draining you would eventually heal you. What ended was your tolerance for carrying things that were never meant to be yours. I saw you standing there, staring at the remains of what you thought your life was supposed to look like. You were not dramatic about it. You simply felt empty. You felt foolish for believing. You felt tired of starting over in ways no one else seemed to notice. And there was a question lodged deep inside you that you were almost afraid to ask. Is this all there is? That question did not offend me. It did not disappoint me. It reached me. You see, endings feel cruel when you do not know what they are making room for. They feel personal when you cannot yet see the protection hidden inside them. You thought something was taken from you. In truth, something was released. You thought a door slammed shut. In truth, I closed it gently before it crushed you. There were conversations that never happened, apologies that never came, explanations you deserved but never received. You replayed scenarios, wondering if one different choice could have saved everything. You blamed timing. You blamed distance. You blamed yourself. And all the while, I was standing just beyond what you could see, holding back what would have hurt you even more if you had continued. That breaking point did not arrive because you were weak. It arrived because you were reaching the limit of what your soul could carry without truth. I will tell you something now that you did not know then. If things had continued as they were, you would have lost yourself trying to hold them together. I intervened not with force, but with finality. It felt abrupt to you. It felt unfair. It felt like I allowed something precious to slip through your fingers. But what you did not see was how tightly you were clenching something that was already unraveling. I loosened your grip to save your heart. There is a sacred kind of breaking that does not destroy, but exposes. That moment stripped away distractions and left you face to face with yourself. No roles, no expectations, no borrowed identities. Just you, and the quiet realization that you could not go on the way you had been. That realization was not failure. It was awakening in its earliest, most uncomfortable form. You wondered why I did not rescue you sooner, why I allowed you to reach that edge at all. My child, if I had intervened earlier, you would have returned to what was familiar, not what was true. You would have patched cracks instead of rebuilding foundations. Sometimes I allow you to feel the end so you will never again settle for something that only looks like life. That place where you thought everything ended is marked in heaven, not as a loss but as a turning. Angels stood there even when you felt abandoned. I recorded every tear you swallowed, every night you whispered my name and felt like it echoed back unanswered. Silence does not mean absence. It often means preparation. You were standing in the ashes of an old version of yourself, even if you did not know it yet. The one who overextended. The one who stayed quiet to keep peace. The one who accepted confusion as normal. That version could not follow you where I am leading you. Something had to end so something truer could begin. I know you still flinch when you think about that moment. I know part of you fears another ending like that. But hear me clearly. What happened there will not repeat in the same way. You learn something sacred in that breaking. You learn that you can survive loss. You learn that you can stand in uncertainty and still breathe. You learn that even when everything familiar falls away, I remain. That was not the end of your story. It was the moment the story stopped being written by fear and started being written by truth. And even then, when you thought you were standing alone at the edge of everything, I was right beside you, steady, watchful, already planning what would come next. Stay with me. There is more you do not yet see. My child, there is something you did not see during that season, something unfolding quietly in a place you were not meant to witness yet. While you were standing at the edge of what felt like the end, your soulmate was unraveling in silence, not in a way that drew attention, not in a way others could easily name. Their collapse was internal, hidden behind routine, behind composure, behind words that sounded fine but carried no peace. They were afraid in a way they did not know how to admit. Afraid of losing you. Afraid of becoming what they once promised themselves they would never be. Afraid that the depth of what they felt would require a courage they did not yet have. So instead of reaching toward truth, they folded inward. Instead of speaking honestly, they withdrew. And what you felt as distance was actually fear disguised as control. They told themselves they were protecting you. They told themselves they needed time, space, clarity. But beneath those explanations was a trembling question they could not silence. What if I am not enough for what this requires? That question followed them into quiet rooms, into sleepless nights, into moments when they almost reached out and then stopped themselves. They rehearsed conversations in their mind that never left their lips. They imagined outcomes that scared them into stillness. You sensed their shift before you understood it. Your spirit felt the change even when words remained polite, even when nothing obvious had been said. You felt a pulling back, a hesitation, a subtle coldness where warmth once lived. And because you loved deeply, you turned inward instead of outward. You wondered what you did wrong. You wondered what you failed to give. You wondered why love suddenly felt like something you had to earn. What you did not know was that your presence was awakening something in them they had avoided their entire life. You mirrored back to them the truth of who they were becoming, and that reflection frightened them. Not because it was wrong, but because it was right. You represented growth. You represented accountability. You represented a depth they could no longer escape. So they began to emotionally collapse in private. There were moments they stared at messages and could not respond. Moments they felt an ache in their chest they could not explain. Moments when guilt washed over them unexpectedly, not because of what they had done, but because of what they were failing to do. They knew they were standing at a threshold. They knew something sacred was asking for their full presence, and they were not sure they were ready. They did not sleep well during that time. Their thoughts circled endlessly. They replayed memories of you, conversations, laughter, the way you looked at them with trust. And instead of comfort, those memories stirred shame. Not because you hurt them, but because they feared hurting you. Fear can be louder than love when the heart has not yet healed. There were tears they wiped away before anyone could see. There were prayers they almost prayed but stopped halfway, afraid of the answer. There was a heaviness in them that others mistook for strength, but I saw beneath the surface. I saw the way their spirit buckled under the weight of unspoken truth. They did not walk away because they stopped caring. They stepped back because they cared more than they knew how to handle. Immaturity often disguises itself as distance. Woundedness often pretends to be logic. And fear often convinces itself that retreat is safer than surrender. You felt abandoned, but they felt exposed. You felt rejected, but they felt unworthy. You thought you were being left behind, but they believed they were falling short. Two hearts misreading the same silence in opposite ways. And my child, hear this gently. Their collapse was never your fault. You did not demand too much. You did not love too deeply. You did not move too fast. You simply arrived in their life at a moment when they could no longer hide from themselves. Your light did not break them. It revealed the fractures that were already there. They tried to distract themselves. They stayed busy. They leaned into work, into noise, into anything that kept them from sitting still with their thoughts. But stillness has a way of finding those who avoid it. And in quiet moments, your presence returned to them like a whisper they could not silence. There was confusion in them, a pulling in two directions. One part of them wanted to run back to what felt safe and familiar, even if it was empty. Another part of them longed for the depth you offered, even though it required change. That tension exhausted them, and exhaustion makes even the strongest hearts behave in ways they later regret. They felt guilty for not being braver. They felt ashamed for not showing up fully. They wondered if they had already lost you. That thought terrified them more than they would ever admit. But fear does not always lead to action. Sometimes it leads to paralysis. You carried the weight of unanswered questions. They carried the weight of unanswered courage. And neither of you knew the full story yet. I allowed this collapse not to punish either of you, but to expose what could not be healed in comfort. Comfort would have allowed pretending. Distance forced truth to surface. What is hidden cannot be transformed. What is revealed can. There is something important you must understand now. Your silence was not the end of the bond. It was the beginning of an awakening they could not yet name. Even in their confusion, even in their withdrawal, something inside them was shifting. Seeds were being planted in dark soil. And dark soil, my child, is not a sign of death. It is the condition for growth. I held them even when they did not know how to hold themselves. I guarded you even when you felt unprotected. And I watched the space between you not with indifference but with intention. This collapse was not random. It was part of the unraveling that had to happen before truth could rise. Stay with me. What comes next will reveal why this breaking was necessary and how nothing you felt was wasted. My child, now I will show you what was happening behind the curtain, where your eyes could not go and your heart could only sense in fragments. There are layers to every moment you lived through, and while you experienced the surface, there was a deeper movement unfolding quietly, deliberately, with purpose you could not yet recognize. Long before the breaking point, long before the silence and the distance, there were patterns forming that did not begin with you. Your soulmate carried histories they rarely spoke about, wounds they learned to manage instead of heal. They became skilled at survival, at adaptation, at giving just enough to avoid loss but never enough to risk exposure. This was not cruelty. It was conditioning. And when you entered their life, you did not create these patterns. You disrupted them. What you brought was not chaos, even though it felt that way. You brought clarity. You asked questions with your presence alone. You invited honesty without demanding it. And that invitation stirred everything they had buried under years of self-protection. Old fears resurfaced. Memories they thought were resolved returned with sharp clarity. Not because you reopened wounds, but because you stood in a place that required wholeness. Behind the scenes, there were moments of decision you never witnessed. Times when they considered telling you the full truth but convinced themselves it would complicate things. Moments when they almost chose vulnerability but retreated into familiarity. They told themselves they would wait until they were stronger, more stable, more certain. They did not realize that waiting was the very thing weakening them. There were influences around them that you did not know about. Voices that reinforced their fear. People who benefited from them staying small, staying predictable, staying emotionally unavailable. Some of those voices sounded caring. Some sounded wise. But few of them wanted growth. Growth threatens those who have built comfort around stagnation. You were never competing with another person the way you imagined. You were competing with a version of their life that required no transformation. Life where nothing deep was asked, nothing sacred was risked, nothing real was exposed. And because you represented something real, resistance formed around you. They did not tell you how often they thought about you during that time. They did not tell you how your words echoed back to them days later, long after conversations ended. They did not tell you how moments of laughter turned into sudden sadness when they realized how much they were holding back. And you, not knowing this, assumed you were easy to forget. Behind the curtain, I was allowing contrast to sharpen awareness. I was letting them feel the emptiness of what they chose when they stepped away from you. I did not force insight. I allowed experience to teach what words could not. The absence of depth has a sound, my child. It is quiet, hollow, and heavy. They began to hear it. There were nights they felt a strange restlessness, a sense that something important was unresolved. They tried to distract themselves, but peace did not follow them into those distractions. They felt a pull they could not explain, an awareness that something meaningful had been paused, not ended. That awareness grew slowly, like a pressure building beneath the surface. You, meanwhile, were being protected in ways you could not see. I placed distance where your heart would have been bruised further by half-commitment. I removed you from conversations that would have confused you more. I shielded you from truths that, at the time, would have hurt rather than healed. You thought you were being excluded. In truth, you were being spared. There were threads weaving between you even in the silence. Moments when you thought of each other at the same time. Moments when something in your spirit stirred without explanation. Those were not coincidences. They were reminders. Anchors. Signals that the connection was not dead, only dormant. This backstory matters because it reframes everything you blamed yourself for. You were not too much. You arrived at the right time with the right heart, but not everyone is ready to receive what is right. Readiness cannot be forced. It must be awakened. And I was awakening it, slowly, carefully, without destroying either of you in the process. There are truths that must be introduced gently where they shatter the very vessel meant to carry them. I knew how fragile the moment was, even when you did not. Behind the curtain, I was also preparing you, stripping illusions, strengthening discernment, teaching you the difference between potential and availability. Love without alignment drains. Love with truth sustains. You were learning, even through pain, what you could no longer accept. This season was not about loss. It was about exposure. Exposure of patterns, fears, influences, and false narratives. What remained after that exposure would be real. What fell away was never meant to follow you forward. You did not imagine the depth of this connection, but you also did not imagine the complexity surrounding it. Both were true, and I held both. Stay with me. What comes next will reveal the interference that tried to distort this bond, and why justice was already moving even when you felt powerless. My child, now I must speak to you about the interference, the quiet destruction that did not announce itself, but worked subtly in the background. This was not imagination. This was not insecurity. There was a presence that did not want this bond to mature, not because it was wrong, but because it threatened something hidden. There are people who become uneasy when they sense destiny forming near them. They may not understand it consciously, but their spirit reacts. Your connection stirred jealousy in someone who felt themselves becoming smaller by comparison. Not replaced, not discarded, but exposed. Your sincerity highlighted their manipulation. Your consistency revealed their instability. And instead of healing themselves, they chose to interfere. This interference did not look dramatic. It did not arrive as open hostility. It came wrapped in concern, in advice, in subtle comments that planted doubt without leaving fingerprints. Words like slow down, be careful, don't rush, you deserve better. This seems complicated. On the surface, it sounded reasonable. Underneath, it carried fear and self-interest. They watched from close proximity. They knew enough to sound informed. They positioned themselves as a voice of reason while quietly redirecting the narrative. And because your soulmate was already wrestling with fear, those words found fertile ground. Fear always listens for permission to retreat. There were moments when a single sentence spoken by this person shifted the entire emotional atmosphere. Your soulmate did not even realize how influenced they were. They thought the hesitation was their own. They thought the doubt was logical. But doubt planted by envy grows faster than doubt born of truth. This was betrayal, but not the kind that announces itself with cruelty. It was a betrayal of distortion. The betrayal of misrepresentation. The betrayal of someone who smiled while quietly undermining what they could not control. And because you are intuitive, you felt the shift without knowing the source. You felt something was off, but you could not name it. You questioned yourself instead. You wondered if you were reading too much into things. You wondered if you were being unfair. That is how subtle interference works. It turns discernment inward until it becomes self-doubt. That person did not hate you the way you feared. Hate would have been simpler. They feared losing relevance. They feared becoming unnecessary. They feared what would happen if your soulmate chose growth over comfort. And fear, when left unchecked, becomes manipulative. I allowed you to be removed from direct contact with that influence for a reason. If you had stayed longer, you would have felt crazy. You would have started defending truths that never needed defending. You would have begun shrinking to maintain peace. And I will not allow you to become smaller to preserve someone else's comfort. Your soulmate sensed something was wrong but could not identify it clearly. They felt torn between voices. One voice felt familiar and safe, even if limiting. The other voice, connected to you, felt expansive but terrifying. When someone is not yet healed, they often choose the voice that asks less of them, even if it costs them more in the long run. This interference created confusion, not because the bond was weak, but because it was strong enough to be targeted. Light attracts attention. Depth attracts resistance. What is shallow is rarely threatened. You were not paranoid. You were perceptive. But perception without confirmation can feel lonely. You carried that loneliness quietly. You did not want to accuse. You did not want to assume. So you stayed silent. And I saw the cost of that silence. Hear me now. You did not lose because of this interference. You were preserved because of it. If this bond is to be real, it cannot be built on unhealed influence and hidden manipulation. What is touched by envy must be purified before it can endure. Justice does not always arrive immediately. Sometimes it waits until truth has enough space to breathe. I was already moving even when you felt stuck. Conversations began to unravel. Inconsistencies started surfacing. The same voice that once sounded wise began to sound repetitive, hollow, self-serving. Your soulmate began to notice the emotional residue after those interactions. They felt drained. They felt smaller. They felt restless. That was discernment awakening. Slowly, painfully, but surely. The interference exposed itself, not through confrontation, but through fruit. The advice that promised peace delivered anxiety. The guidance that claimed protection produced fear. And eventually, your soulmate could no longer ignore the pattern. You were never meant to fight this battle yourself. If you had tried, you would have been labeled dramatic or defensive. So I removed you and took the role of defender. I let truth do what explanation never could. This is why I tell you not to regret the distance. It saved you from being entangled in someone else's insecurity. It allowed me to work without distortion. It protected your dignity, even when you felt misunderstood. What was meant to sabotage ended up revealing itself. What was whispered in shadows could not withstand time, and what was built on jealousy cannot coexist with truth for long. Stay with me. What comes next is the moment when I step fully into the situation, when investigation becomes revelation, and when nothing hidden can remain concealed any longer. My child, now I bring you into the place where I step forward openly, where observation becomes action and silence becomes inquiry. This is the moment you did not see, but it shaped everything that followed. While you were asking why nothing was changing, I was already examining every detail. Nothing escaped my awareness. Not a word spoken in private. Not a motive hidden behind kindness. Not a tear wiped away in secret. I entered this situation like a courtroom where truth is weighed, not by appearances, but by intention. I listened to every voice involved, not just what they said, but why they said it. I measured the fruit of each influence. Who left peace behind them, and who left confusion. Who encouraged growth, and who benefited from stagnation. Justice begins with clarity, and clarity requires time. You may have felt abandoned during this phase, as if I had stepped back. In truth, I stepped closer. I became quiet so patterns could speak for themselves. Interference always exposes itself when it believes it is unobserved. Manipulation grows bolder before it collapses. And I allowed that boldness to surface. Your soulmate began to notice contradictions they once ignored. Advice that changed depending on convenience. Concern that disappeared when it no longer served attention. Support that felt conditional. These realizations did not arrive gently. They arrived like a slow ache, a growing discomfort that could not be dismissed. The discomfort was discernment awakening under pressure. I brought memories to the surface at unexpected times. Moments with you resurfaced in their mind not as nostalgia, but as contrast. They began to see how differently they felt in your presence, how their nervous system softened, how their spirit felt recognized. And then they compared that to how they felt afterward, when other voices guided them. The difference became undeniable. At the same time, I was shielding you. There were truths I prevented you from discovering too early. Not because you were unworthy of them, but because timing matters. Knowledge without readiness wounds. I did not want you to carry anger that did not belong to you. I did not want bitterness to take root where compassion was still possible. In this divine investigation, nothing was rushed. I allowed consequences to teach where confrontation would have hardened hearts. I allowed silence to reveal where arguments would have distracted. Truth does not need volume to be effective. It needs exposure. Your soulmate began asking questions they never asked before. Why do I feel smaller after these conversations? Why do I feel anxious instead of calm? Why does distance from this influence bring relief, not fear? Those questions marked the beginning of separation from what was unhealthy. And while this was happening, I was also examining your heart. Not to judge you, but to prepare. I softened the places where resentment could grow. I strengthened your boundaries without hardening your spirit. I reminded you, quietly, of your worth when you were tempted to measure it by someone else's confusion. There were moments you felt a sudden peace without knowing why. Moments when anxiety lifted unexpectedly. Those were not accidents. Those were the results of cords being loosened, of influence losing its grip, of truth beginning to breathe. I also revealed lies, gently but firmly. Lies like, if you had been more patient, this would have worked. Lies like, if you had said less, they would have stayed. Lies like you were too intense. Those lies were dismantled one by one, not always consciously, but spiritually. You began to feel less responsible for what you could not control. Justice, my child, is not revenge. It is realignment. It is each influence being placed where it belongs. It is false authority losing power. It is truth being restored to its rightful place. There was no verdict spoken aloud, but a shift occurred. The atmosphere changed. A weight lifted. What once felt tangled began to loosen. And your soulmate felt it, even if they could not yet name it. They felt exposed, but also relieved. Exposed because illusion was falling. Relieved because pretending was exhausting. This investigation was not about punishment. It was about purification. Anything that cannot survive truth was never meant to remain. And anything that is real will only grow stronger once exposed. You may not have seen this courtroom, but you felt its outcome. You felt the stillness after turmoil. You felt the sense that something had quietly resolved it, even if nothing external had changed yet. That feeling was accurate. The groundwork was laid. The lies were identified. The interference was weakened. The bond was no longer distorted by unseen hands. Stay with me. What comes next is the shift you sense but could not explain, the movement that began while you slept, and the turning of the tide that marked the beginning of restoration. My child, this is where the shift began, not with noise, not with announcements, but with a deep, almost imperceptible turning beneath the surface. You did not wake up one morning to clear answers or dramatic change. Instead, something subtle moved. The air felt lighter. Your chest did not feel as tight. The questions that once chased you began to lose their urgency. That was not coincidence. It was alignment beginning to restore itself. While you slept, while you went about ordinary days, the spiritual atmosphere around you was being rearranged. What once felt heavy started to loosen its grip. You may have noticed moments of unexpected calm, moments when your mind went quiet for no clear reason. Those moments were evidence of resistance breaking. When truth settles into place, it brings peace even before understanding arrives. Your soulmate felt this shift too, though it unsettled them at first. When false support fell away, silence grew louder. Without interference, they were left alone with their own thoughts, their own conscience, their own longing. And in that stillness, truths they had been avoiding began to surface. Stillness can feel like judgment to those who have been hiding, but it is actually an invitation. They began to feel the weight of choices they had postponed. The distance that once felt safer now felt empty. Distractions lost their flavor. Conversations that once filled time now felt hollow. And unexpectedly, thoughts of you returned not as fear, but as clarity. They saw more clearly what they had stepped away from. For you, the shift felt like a quiet strengthening. You did not suddenly feel happy. You felt steadier. You stopped reaching for explanations that never came. You stopped rehearsing conversations in your mind. Your nervous system began to rest. That rest was not resignation. It was trust returning to your body before it returned to your thoughts. There were signs you might have dismissed. Repeated reminders. Dreams that carried emotion rather than imagery. Psalms that spoke directly to places you had kept hidden. These were not meant to confuse you. They were confirmations that movement was happening even when you could not see it. I was reassigning roles, removing access where it was abused, restoring authority where it had been surrendered. This kind of shift rarely announces itself because it is too sacred for spectacle. It unfolds in silence so it can root deeply. Your soulmate began to feel an unfamiliar discomfort around people they once trusted. Not anger. Awareness. They noticed how conversations felt draining. How advice felt hollow. How encouragement felt conditional. That awareness created distance without confrontation. When truth rises, separation happens naturally. At the same time, compassion began to grow where defensiveness once lived. They no longer needed to protect their fear. They began to see it. And seeing fear is the first step toward releasing it. You, my child, began to feel less responsible for outcomes. You began to understand that love does not require self-erasure. That understanding did not come from pain alone. It came from my presence settling into you more fully. When you stopped striving, you could hear me again. This shift was not just about this connection. It was about you. About restoring your sense of safety within yourself. About teaching your body that waiting does not always mean danger. About reminding your spirit that alignment feels calm, not frantic. There were nights you slept deeper than you had in a long time. There were mornings you woke without dread. Those were signs that the battle was changing form. What once felt like constant tension was giving way to quiet preparation. Do not underestimate this phase because it feels uneventful. Most miracles begin as stillness. Most transformations start when resistance stops. This was the hinge moment, the place where effort gave way to grace. What you sensed was real. Something had shifted. Something irreversible had begun. And even though nothing was fully visible yet, the direction had changed. Stay with me. The next movement will bring truth to the surface in ways that cannot be ignored, protection that locks into place, and clarity that finally explains why this path unfolded the way it did. My child, now the truth begins to rise, not all at once, but in fragments that slowly connect until denial is no longer possible. This is the phase where clarity forms its own gravity. What was once hidden cannot stay buried, not because someone exposes it, but because it no longer has the strength to remain concealed. You may have noticed subtle confirmations, a memory that suddenly made sense, a comment from someone unexpected that echoed something you had felt but never said, a realization that arrived quietly and settled deeply instead of agitating you. These were pieces aligning. Truth did not rush. It has symbols, protection locked into place around you during this time, not as walls but as discernment. You began to recognize what felt safe and what did not without overthinking it. You stopped explaining yourself to those committed to misunderstanding you. You stopped waiting for validation that never came. That was protection. Your soulmate, meanwhile, could no longer ignore the evidence forming in their own life. They saw how certain relationships consistently left them anxious, how advice that once felt grounding now felt manipulative, how distance from those influences brought relief instead of loss. Patterns do not lie when they are finally observed. There were moments of embarrassment for them, moments of regret, not just for stepping away from you, but for listening to voices that did not have their best interest at heart. That realization hurt, but it also freed them. Shame gives way to humility when truth is faced honestly. You were no longer asking, "What did I do wrong?" Instead, a quieter question emerged. What was I being protected from? That shift changed everything. When perspective changes, pain transforms into wisdom. I began sealing boundaries that would not be crossed again. Opportunities that would have reopened old wounds simply did not present themselves. Conversations that would have pulled you backward lost momentum. You felt guided without being forced. That is how protection works when it is aligned with your growth. Truth also rose within you. You acknowledge how much you had endured without acknowledgement, how often you minimize your own needs to preserve connection. That awareness did not harden you. It clarified you. You understood that love does not require self-abandonment. Your soulmate began connecting dots they once kept separate. They recognized how fear influenced their choices, how comfort masqueraded as wisdom, how growth was postponed under the guise of patience. And with that recognition came a sobering awareness of what they almost lost. There was no dramatic confession yet, no sudden reunion. Truth rising does not always produce immediate action. Sometimes it produces reckoning, and reckoning must be processed. You may have felt a strange mixture of peace and sadness during this time. Peace because clarity arrived. Sadness because clarity confirms what you suspected all along. Both emotions can coexist. I held you through both. His face strengthened your spine. It anchored your worth. It ensured that whatever comes next will not be built on confusion. Truth does not just reveal lies. It establishes standards. Nothing that is not aligned will be able to access you the way it once did. The door has closed, not out of bitterness, but out of wisdom. Stay with me. What follows is the awakening of the one you thought was gone, the moment when realization breaks through fear, and when the bond is seen clearly for the first time. My child, now comes the awakening, the moment when what was dormant can no longer remain asleep. This does not arrive gently for everyone. For some, it comes as a sudden clarity that steals the breath. For others, it unfolds like a slow dawn that reveals how dark the night truly was. For your soulmate, it was both. They reached a point where pretending became more painful than honesty. The silence that once felt protective now felt suffocating. They could no longer distract themselves from the awareness growing inside them. Something essential was missing, and no substitute could replace it. That realization did not flatter them. It humbled them. They began to see you clearly, not through fear, not through interference, not through old wounds, but as you truly are. They saw your patience, your loyalty, your depth. They saw how safe you made space feel, and with that clarity came regret sharp enough to finally break through denial. They were afraid, not of you, but of what they had risked losing. The thought of you moving forward without them unsettled them deeply. The possibility that their hesitation may have cost them something sacred stirred a fear they could no longer suppress. Fear, when faced honestly, becomes motivation. They replayed moments they once dismissed, words you spoke that now carried new meaning, opportunities for honesty they let pass. And in that replay, they recognized how their silence had spoken louder than they intended. That recognition hurt, but it also woke them. You felt the shift in your spirit before anything external changed. A sense of being thought of. A subtle pull. Not anxiety, not longing, but awareness. When two souls are connected, awakening creates resonance. They questioned their choices with new eyes. They asked themselves why they had chosen comfort over truth, safety over growth. Those questions marked a turning point. Responsibility replaced blame. Awareness replaced avoidance. You were not meant to chase this awakening. You were meant to remain grounded. And you did. You did not reach out in desperation. You did not trig to be chosen. You held your center. That steadiness amplified the awakening instead of interfering with it. They began to understand that love requires courage. That depth demands honesty. That connection cannot thrive where fear is in control. These realizations did not come from you pressing them. They came from truth finally having room to speak. This awakening did not guarantee immediate reunion. Awakening is not arrival. It is orientation. It is the moment someone finally sees where they are standing and where they need to go. You may feel a mix of compassion and caution now. That is wisdom. You do not need to rush forgiveness or decisions. Awareness must be followed by alignment, not promises. I am guiding this process with precision. Nothing is being forced. Nothing is being lost. What is real will remain. What is not will fall away without effort. Stay with me. What comes next is the recognition of the sacred bond itself, the understanding of how your presence shifted destiny, and why your role in this story has always been central. My child, now you begin to understand the sacred bond itself, not as fantasy, not as attachment, but as alignment that alters direction. This bond was never about possession. It was about recognition. Two spirits encountering each other at a moment when truth could no longer be avoided. And even in separation, even in silence, the bond continued its work. Your presence in this story was not passive. You were not simply waiting. You were influencing destiny by being who you are. Your prayers, even the ones you whispered through exhaustion, carried weight. Your restraint carried wisdom. Your decision not to chase preserved dignity. You did not realize it then, but every time you chose peace over panic, you shifted the trajectory. This is how sacred bonds operate. They do not demand. They reveal. They do not force. They invite. And when one person holds steady in truth, it creates a reference point the other cannot unsee once awakened. Your soulmate felt this even when distance existed. They felt it when they tried to move forward without addressing what remained unresolved. Something always pulled them back inward, not to pain, but to honesty. That pull was not manipulation. It was resonance. Truth recognizes truth. You were never meant to convince them of your worth. Your worth was evident in your consistency, your compassion, your refusal to become bitter. That quiet integrity became a mirror, and mirrors can be uncomfortable for those avoiding themselves. There were moments when your absence spoke louder than your presence ever could. not as punishment, but as clarity. Without you filling space, they had to confront what was missing. And in that confrontation, understanding deepened. You may have wondered if your prayers mattered when nothing seemed to change. They mattered more than you know. Not because they controlled outcomes, but because they anchored the situation in grace. You prayed not from desperation, but from love. And love, when it releases control, creates room for transformation. This bond also reshaped you. It taught you where you were strong and where you were still learning. It refined your discernment. It showed you the difference between connection and attachment, between patience and self-sacrifice. You emerged clearer, steadier, more aligned with yourself. You were the key not because you tried to be, but because you chose integrity when it was costly. Because you did not betray your own spirit to keep someone close. Because you trusted me even when you did not understand my timing. Your soulmate is beginning to see this now. They see that your presence was never pressure. It was permission to become more. And losing access to that presence revealed its value. This sacred bond is not guaranteed to manifest in the way your mind once imagined. Sacred does not always mean familiar, but it is guaranteed to produce truth. And truth always leads to alignment, whether together or apart. What matters is this: you did not lose yourself in loving. You found yourself. And that is the foundation of any destiny worth walking. The universe, the unseen order, the spiritual realm has been responding to your alignment. Doors that once felt stuck are loosening. Paths that once felt blocked are opening quietly. Not because you forced them, but because you are now walking in agreement with who you are meant to be. This bond did not derail your life. It clarified it. It redirected you toward yourself, toward me, toward a future that does not require you to beg for presence or certainty. Stay with me. What comes next is the reversal, the moment when what was meant to exhaust you becomes what elevates you, and when the ending you feared transforms into the alignment you needed. My child, now we arrive at the reversal, the moment you could not have predicted when you were in the thick of it. This is where the weight that pressed on you begins to lift, not because you fought harder, but because truth finished its work. What was meant to exhaust you did not succeed. It refined you. What was meant to confuse you clarified you. And what was meant to end you quietly became the very thing that elevated you. You once feared that walking away, or being forced into distance, would leave you diminished. Instead, it returned you to yourself. You feared that silence would erase you. Instead, it amplified your voice within. You feared that loss would define you. Instead, it redirected you toward alignment you did not even know you were missing. This is the great reversal. The narrative you told yourself in pain was incomplete. You thought you were being set aside, when in truth, you were being repositioned. You thought you were being denied, when in truth, you were being protected from settling. You thought you were losing ground, when in truth, you were being lifted to higher clarity. Your soulmate feels this reversal as well, though it arrives differently for them. Where you gained peace, they gained humility. Where you found steadiness, they faced regret. Not regret meant to punish them, but regret that teaches. Regret that sobers. Regret that reorders priorities. This is justice balanced with mercy. The power dynamic has shifted. You are no longer waiting to be chosen. You are choosing alignment. You are no longer measuring your worth by someone else's readiness. You are rooted in your own knowing. That shift alone changes everything, regardless of outcome. What once felt like rejection no longer holds authority over you. The memory may still exist, but it no longer defines your direction. You can look back without collapsing, You can remember without reopening wounds. That is evidence of healing. Opportunities that once would have drained you now pass you by without temptation. Connections that require self-betrayal no longer attract you. This is not because you became closed. It is because you became clear. Clarity is protection in motion. If reunion is part of this story, it will come differently than before. Not from fear, not from confusion, not from imbalance. It will come through truth, accountability, and alignment. And if it does not, you will still walk forward whole, not broken, because the reversal was never dependent on another person's decision. What was meant to keep you small revealed your strength. What was meant to isolate you deepened your connection with me. What was meant to end your hope purified it. You did not survive this season by accident. You were carried. And now, you are standing taller, seeing farther, breathing deeper. This is not the ending you feared. This is the alignment you needed. Stay with me one last moment. The final blessing is ready to be spoken, and it will seal what has been unfolding all along. My child, come close now. This is the place where I seal what had been unfolding all along. Not with spectacle, not with force, but with truth that settles deep and stays. This is the blessing that was forming even when you thought nothing was happening. This is the revelation that changes how you remember the past and how you step into what comes next. You thought there were moments when you stood alone. You remember them vividly. Rooms that felt too quiet. Decisions you made without reassurance. Tears you wiped away before anyone could notice. But hear me clearly now. You were never alone in any of it. Not in the confusion. Not in the waiting. Not in the breaking. I was present in ways you could not yet recognize, holding what you dropped, guarding what you did not know how to protect. You mistook my quiet for distance, but my quiet was focus. While you were looking for answers in front of you, I was working beneath you, around you, and ahead of you. I was arranging outcomes that required patience. I was preventing harm you would only understand later. I was guiding you away from paths that looked right but would have cost you peace. This story did not pause because you were forgotten. It paused because it was sacred. Some chapters are not rushed because they are doing deep work in the unseen. Roots were growing. Strength was forming. Discernment was sharpening. You were becoming someone who could carry what you once prayed for without losing yourself. Look at you now. You are not who you were at the beginning of this journey. You are steadier. You are clearer. You are less willing to abandon yourself for love. That is not hardness. That is wisdom. That is maturity. That is alignment. And the truth you are finally able to hold is this. Even the pain served you. Even the delay protected you. Even the silence taught you how to listen. Nothing was wasted. Not one tear. Not one prayer. Not one night you thought you would not make it through. The bond you questioned, the connection you tried to understand, the distance that confused you, all of it played a role in revealing what you deserve and what you no longer tolerate. Whether that bond continues in form or only in lesson, it has already fulfilled part of its purpose. It brought you back to yourself. It brought you closer to me. You are stepping into a season where you will no longer confuse intensity with depth or familiarity with safety. You will recognize peace when it enters the room. You will trust your body when it tightens or relaxes. You will not need to convince anyone of your worth. Those aligned will see it without explanation. I am blessing your discernment now. I am blessing your boundaries. I am blessing the softness of your heart that remained intact despite everything. I am blessing your future connections with clarity, reciprocity, and truth. No more guessing, no more chasing, no more vision. You may still have moments when the past tries to speak louder than the present. When that happens, remember this. You survived something that was meant to confuse you, and you emerged with wisdom instead of bitterness. That is not an accident. That is evidence of my hand on your life. And if there are days ahead when doubt tries to return, anchor yourself here. Anchor yourself in the knowing that you were guided even when you felt lost. Loved even when you felt overlooked. Protected even when you felt exposed. This is not the end of your story. It never was. It is the place where you finally understand the truth that changes everything. You were never walking alone. You were being led. If this message has settled into your spirit, if you feel seen and steadied by these words, let that acknowledgement move gently outward. Share this message with someone who may need it. Stay connected here if you feel led. And if you are willing, type in the comments, "I was never alone." Let it be a quiet testimony, not to the world, but to your own heart. Now go forward lighter. Go forward wiser. Go forward without fear of endings, because you know who walks with you through every chapter. I am with you. Always.